It's kind of amazing when you think about it. There's this whole approach to education. It's been around for over a century, shows really positive results for kids, really lines up with how we now understand learning and development, and it's used worldwide, literally across the globe.
Right. You'd think something like that would be, front and center in all the discussions about how to improve schools, but it's not. It's kind of pushed to the side.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this topic so intriguing. Today, we're diving deep into Montessori education.
Yeah.
And as this paper we've been digging into puts it, Montessori is shunned and admired. And that's a pretty powerful statement, right? Like, why such strong feelings on both sides? So for anyone trying to make sense of all the different educational approaches out there, I think this is worth exploring.
I completely agree. And for you, our listener who wants to really get a handle on this, like what's the essence of Montessori, but you don't have time to wade through tons of academic writing, that's where we come in.
Exactly. So we've been really digging into this piece. It's called Shunned and Admired, Montessori, Self-Determination, and a Case for Radical School Reform.
Really strong title.
Yeah, and it's by Angeline S. Lillard. She's a professor at the University of Virginia in the psychology department.
Perfect person to tackle this, really.
Absolutely. So our mission today, let's lay it out. We want to understand the core principles of Montessori, like what makes it tick, what does the research actually say about its effectiveness, like does it really deliver? And I think the biggest question, why isn't it more widespread? Like, what are the barriers? So we're going to go through all of that, and hopefully along the way, we can all learn something about education in general, maybe rethink some of our assumptions.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's start with why people are so drawn to Montessori.
Oh.
I think a good place to begin is with the outcomes for kids. Like, what do we actually see?
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's where the research comes in. But first, gotta be honest, researching a whole school model like this has its own set of challenges.
Right, because it's not just like testing out a new textbook or something.
Exactly. It's more about the overall environment, right? So
Yeah.
you can't easily do what researchers love, random assignment. Like you can't just tell families, okay, your kid's going to the Montessori school and yours is going to the traditional school.
Of course not.
But what researchers have done is get pretty clever. They've taken advantage of these situations where you have public Montessori schools that have way more applicants than spots.
Oh, interesting.
So they use a lottery system to decide who gets in.
Makes sense.
And that creates like this natural comparison group. You have the kids who wanted to go to the Montessori school but didn't get picked. And then you have the kids who did.
Right. Okay, so you're basically as close to a controlled experiment as you can get in this kind of real-world situation.
Exactly. And the findings from these lottery studies, they're pretty remarkable. Like one key study done by Lillard and Elsquest back in 2006 looked at kids in this really highly regarded public Montessori school.
Right.
And they looked at two age groups, 5-year-olds and 12-year-olds. So by age 5, what they found was the Montessori kids were already doing better in things like recognizing letters and words, basic reading skills, sounding out words, what we call word attack, and even solving math problems, the kind of practical math that you use in everyday life.
Wow, so they were already ahead in those core academic areas.
Mm-hmm. And not just that, they were also showing stronger what we call executive function. And that's like the brain's control system, right? It's the ability to focus your attention, plan things out, switch between different tasks.
Really important skills.
Absolutely. And then in terms of social skills, the Montessori kids were better at solving social problems and understanding those kind of unspoken social cues.
Interesting.
Even on the playground, there were differences. The Montessori kids were engaging in more positive interactions, more cooperation, less of that kind of rough and tumble play that can sometimes, be a little unclear.
Right. Sometimes that roughhousing can turn into something else.
Exactly. So it seems like even from a young age, Montessori's fostering this more well-rounded development, academic, cognitive, and social.
Yeah, that's a lot of advantages to be seeing at such a young age.
Yeah.
What about the older kids, the 12-year-olds, you said?
Yeah. So with them, you saw some really fascinating stuff. For one, they were writing more creative stories, like their imaginations were just flowing.
Mm-hmm.
But not only that, their stories were also more structurally sophisticated. Like they had a better grasp of how to put a story together.
Makes sense if they've had more practice.
Right. And when they had disagreements with their peers, they were better at using those constructive strategies to find solutions. And they also reported this stronger sense of community in their school.
So they felt more connected to their school as a whole.
Yeah, it wasn't just about, their individual classes, but like the whole school environment felt more supportive.
That's a really positive picture,
Yeah.
and it's consistent across different age groups. Now, this isn't just one study showing this, right?
Oh, no, not at all. There's another really important study that followed a group of preschoolers over time.
Okay.
And this one was in Hartford, Connecticut. So these kids, they were also admitted to high-quality public Montessori schools in a lower-income area through a lottery system.
Okay.
And at the start, the kids in both groups, the ones who got into Montessori and the ones who didn't, they were pretty similar in terms of their backgrounds and abilities.
Right.
But by the end of kindergarten, whoa, the Montessori kids were showing higher levels of academic achievement, better understanding of social situations. They were also more persistent, like when they faced a challenging task, they stuck with it longer.
That's huge.
And they even said they enjoyed the academic work more.
Wow, so it wasn't just about doing better, they actually liked learning more.
It seems that way. And
Okay.
get this, even before kindergarten, by the end of their pre-K4 year, they already had stronger executive function skills.
So those core cognitive skills were getting a boost early on.
hmm And you mentioned earlier that these schools were in a lower income area. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially for anyone concerned about, equity in education.
Absolutely.
So what they found was that the lower income kids in the Montessori program, they significantly closed the achievement gap with their higher income peers.
No way, that's huge.
It is. The connection between family income and how well a child does academically, it was only about half as strong in the Montessori schools compared to regular schools.
So basically, Montessori was leveling the playing field.
That's a powerful way to put it. And it was even less than half as strong compared to other public magnet schools in the same city.
So it wasn't just about Montessori being better overall, it was specifically better at closing that gap.
Exactly.
That's a really compelling argument for Montessori as a tool for promoting educational fairness.
It really is.
Wow. And you mentioned that these lottery studies, they showed what researchers call strong effect sizes.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean exactly?
So it means that the differences they saw weren't just statistically significant, like they weren't just a fluke. They were actually practically meaningful. Like you would notice these differences in the real world.
Right. So it wasn't just like a tiny blip in the data. It was a real noticeable difference.
Exactly. And beyond these really well-designed lottery studies, there's this whole body of research that compares students in Montessori schools to those in traditional schools. But you got to remember, like we talked about, parents choosing Montessori might be doing other things at home that support learning too.
Right. So it's not always a perfect apples-to-apples comparison.
Yeah, there's that caveat. But these studies still offer a lot of valuable information, especially when their findings back up what we see in the lottery studies.
Like what have they found?
Well, for instance, one study found that kids who went to public Montessori schools through 5th grade, they ended up doing better in math and science in high school compared to similar students in traditional schools. And other research has shown better social and emotional outcomes for middle schoolers in Montessori programs.
So the benefits seem to carry over into later years.
It seems so. And then there was this big study in South Carolina that found higher standardized test scores across the board in public Montessori schools.
So even on those traditional measures, Montessori seems to be holding its own.
Yeah. So when you look at it all together, across different ages, different ways of measuring success, you see this pretty consistent pattern of positive outcomes.
It's pretty impressive. Now, I also noticed that the paper talked about how Montessori might be especially good for racial equity in schools.
Oh, that's a really important point. So right now, over half the kids in public Montessori schools in the U.S. are students of color.
Oh, wow.
And the research is showing that these students tend to have better academic results and they face less racial bias in school discipline in Montessori compared to traditional schools.
So it's a more equitable environment for them.
It seems so.
That's another really strong point in its favor. Now, the paper did mention that not all studies have found better academic outcomes in Montessori.
Right.
What's the deal with those mixed results?
Well, it seems like a lot of those studies where Montessori didn't show a clear advantage, they didn't really assess how well Montessori was actually being implemented.
Oh, interesting.
Like you can't just slap a Montessori label on a classroom and expect magic to happen.
Of course not.
There's a whole philosophy and a way of doing things, right? And a couple of experimental studies by Lillard specifically showed that the kids in classrooms using only authentic Montessori materials, they made more progress than kids in classrooms that mixed Montessori and non-Montessori stuff.
So sticking to the method matters.
It really does. And there's another interesting study that found that just adding certain Montessori-based exercises to a regular preschool curriculum led to improvements in kids' fine motor skills.
So even little bits of Montessori can make a difference.
Yeah, but to really see the full benefits, it seems like fidelity to the model is key.
Makes sense.
Hmm.
But even with all this research, the paper points out there are still areas where we need more, to have a complete picture.
Absolutely.
Like, what are some of those gaps?
Well, for one, we need more direct comparisons between Montessori and other specific alternative approaches.
Right, like how does it stack up against, say, Waldorf or Reggio
Yep,
Emilia?
exactly. And we need a better understanding of how Montessori works for kids whose parents might not be, actively seeking out these different educational philosophies.
Right, so kids who just happen to end up in a Montessori school.
Yeah, and more research on the effects for kids younger than 3 and older than 6 would be great.
Okay.
And like we talked about, understanding how variations in implementation affect outcomes is huge.
Absolutely.
The paper also says we need more studies where teachers are randomly assigned to get Montessori training, and we need more long-term studies that follow students over many years.
Right, like what happens to these kids once they leave Montessori?
Yeah. Exactly. And there's also the question of dosage, like how much Montessori is optimal, and are there certain periods in development where it's especially impactful? Like, are there critical periods? We need more research on all of that.
So lots of exciting avenues for future research.
Mm-hmm.
But the outcomes for children are just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Mm-hmm.
What about the teachers? Like, what's their experience with Montessori?
Well, it turns out teacher satisfaction is another big reason why Montessori is so appealing.
Okay.
They tend to report way higher levels of job satisfaction compared to teachers in traditional public schools.
Really?
Yeah, like, remember that South Carolina study we mentioned?
Mm-hmm.
They found that 98%, almost all the Montessori teachers, said they loved or liked their job.
That's amazing.
And that's compared to 89% of all public school teachers in South Carolina, which is pretty much in line with the national average.
That's a pretty significant difference.
Mhm.
And the paper mentioned that this high satisfaction, it was there even when teachers felt like they were facing some challenges.
Right. It's not like everything was perfect. A lot of them said they had to make compromises to the program because they didn't have full support or resources.
Like what kind of compromises?
Well, things like not having a complete set of Montessori materials or maybe not getting enough support from the administration.
Makes sense.
But the interesting thing is, national surveys of public school teachers show that job satisfaction can be much lower, like around 65%, especially when teachers feel unsupported.
So even with some obstacles, the Montessori teachers are still finding something really fulfilling in their work.
Yeah. It seems like they're more resilient, more able to deal with challenges.
So what contributes to that? What makes them so satisfied?
Well, research shows that teacher job satisfaction is tied to a few things, like, the relationships they have with their students, the feeling that they're seeing their students grow and develop, and having a positive school climate overall.
Makes sense.
And Montessori schools, they tend to foster a more positive social environment. Plus, teachers often work with the same group of kids for 3 years, so they get to build these deeper, more meaningful relationships.
That continuity must be really valuable.
Yeah. And then there's the Montessori teacher training itself, which is pretty unique. It's not just about learning the curriculum. It's about developing a certain mindset and a set of values that align with the Montessori philosophy.
Oh, interesting.
And a big part of that is fostering kids' independence.
Right, giving them that freedom to explore and learn on their own.
Exactly.
It makes sense that if you feel like you're really supporting a child's individual journey, that would be really rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
But the paper does bring up a point about who chooses to become a Montessori teacher in the first place.
Yeah, there's that.
Yeah.
It could be that people who already enjoy teaching, who are naturally drawn to a more child-centered approach, they're the ones who seek out Montessori training. So there could be some self-selection going on, but the positive outcomes we see in the studies, those suggest that the system itself is also creating this more satisfying and effective environment.
So it's probably a combination of both. The teachers are already inclined that way, and then the Montessori approach amplifies those tendencies.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, so we've talked about the kids and the teachers. What about the parents? Why are they so often big fans of Montessori?
Parent endorsement, that's a huge part of why Montessori persists. Unlike regular public schools where parents often don't have much choice in their kids' education, enrolling a child in Montessori, that's usually a really conscious decision.
Right, it's an active choice.
Yeah. And the fact that we're seeing more and more public Montessori schools popping up, that's largely driven by parents demanding it.
Wow. So there's a real grassroots movement happening.
There is. And the research shows that parents, especially middle-class parents, they love that Montessori emphasizes self-determination and, really respects children as individuals.
That makes sense.
They also really like the learning environment, the hands-on materials, and they believe that Montessori will lead to good academic outcomes, but also, that inner motivation, a real love of learning.
So it's not just about test scores for them.
Nope, it's about the whole child. But the paper does mention that some parents, especially those from lower income backgrounds, they sometimes worry about whether Montessori is rigorous enough academically,
Oh, interesting.
which, seems kind of counter to the research we just discussed.
Right, all that evidence suggesting Montessori kids do really well academically.
Exactly. So there's this gap between perception and reality.
It's a good reminder that everyone comes to this with their own baggage and their own assumptions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so these external factors, the positive outcomes for kids, the satisfaction of teachers, the parent support, those all contribute to why Montessori is so admired.
hmm
But now let's shift gears. The paper also talks about the intrinsic reasons for Montessori's lasting appeal. And it starts with this idea that Montessori is really aligned with developmental science.
Oh, yeah, this is really fascinating. So, Montessori's whole philosophy, it came from her incredibly detailed observations of kids.
Right, she spent years just watching how children learn and develop naturally.
Exactly. And that's probably a big reason why it fits so well with what we've learned from decades of research in developmental and educational psychology.
So it's like she was ahead of her time in a lot of ways.
It seems so. And she was aware of this connection. She even called her system psychopedagogy.
Psychopedagogy, what a mouthful.
I know, right? And get this, her first book, she subtitled it A Scientific Method of Pedagogy as Applied to Child Education in the Children's Houses.
Wow, she was serious about the science of it all.
Totally. And her observations, they weren't limited to just one type of kid or one setting.
Right, she worked with a pretty diverse group of children.
Yeah, she studied kids with developmental differences, kids living in poverty, and eventually kids from all different backgrounds on multiple continents.
That's a really impressive scope.
It is. And I think that's part of why the principles she identified feel so universal. Like they apply to all kids, regardless of their background or culture.
That makes sense. So what was the core idea she arrived at? Like, what was the essence of it all?
She believed that the ultimate goal of education is to provide help given in order that the human personality may achieve its independence.
Help given in order that the human personality may achieve its independence. That's a powerful statement.
It is. And the paper connects this to a really important theory in psychology called self-determination theory.
Okay, so what is that?
It's this theory developed by Ryan and Deci, and it says that humans have three basic psychological needs: competence, autonomy, and relatedness.
Okay, break those down for me.
So competence, that's like feeling capable, feeling like you can do things effectively. Autonomy is basically independence, being able to make your own choices. And relatedness, that's about feeling connected to others, feeling like you belong.
Okay, that makes sense. And how does Montessori support those needs?
Well, in a Montessori classroom, you have kids interacting freely with each other, right? It's a very social environment, and that fosters relatedness.
Mm-hmm.
And the activities are designed to be appropriately challenging, but kids get to choose what they work on, so they're building that sense of competence.
So they're constantly engaged in activities they find interesting and that are at their level.
Exactly. And then that emphasis on freedom of choice, on letting kids work independently, that directly supports autonomy.
Because it's baked into the whole system.
It is. And the paper dives into several specific aspects of the Montessori environment and how they really promote self-determination.
Okay, let's get into those.
All right, so the first, and this is a big one, is the principle of free choice.
Yeah, that seems like a cornerstone of the whole approach. And there's a lot of research showing that having choices is good for us, right?
Tons of it. Studies have shown that when people feel like they have control over their choices, they're more engaged, they learn better, and they're just happier overall.
Makes sense.
Like the paper mentions, kids are more motivated to solve puzzles if they get to choose the type of puzzle.
Interesting.
And even babies, they show more positive emotions when they can control a mobile above their crib.
Wow, so it starts really early.
It does. And Montessori herself was very clear about this. She said, children have free choice all day long. They cannot learn through obedience to the commands of another.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah. And this insight came early in her career, like back when she was first starting out in her classroom in Rome. She noticed that even before the formal lessons started, the kids were spontaneously grabbing materials and getting totally absorbed in them.
So they were naturally drawn to certain activities.
And she realized that was a powerful sign of their internal motivation, that they had this drive to learn and explore on their own terms.
And that connects to like those natural stages of development we see in kids, right? Like when they're learning to walk or talk, they don't need someone forcing them to do it.
Exactly. Montessori saw those milestones as evidence of this innate drive towards self-development. Like, kids are naturally motivated to overcome challenges and learn, but they need the right environment and the freedom to explore it.
It reminds me of that idea of informal learning, where kids learn by just being involved in everyday activities, by observing and participating.
Totally. And it also fits with what they call the Goldilocks effect, which is the idea that young learners are drawn to tasks that are just a little bit beyond what they can already do.
Right, so it's not too easy, not too hard, but just right.
Exactly. And they kind of naturally tailor their own learning experiences that way.
Makes sense.
The paper even compares it to nutrition. Like, there are studies showing that when you give kids a variety of healthy foods, they often choose a pretty balanced diet overall.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it's like the Montessori classroom is this buffet of healthy choices for the mind.
I like that analogy.
And Montessori believed that the two biggest things that get in the way of this natural self-development are, first, too much adult interference.
Right, like constantly telling kids what to do and how to do it.
Yeah, or using rewards and punishments to control their behavior. And the second obstacle is a lack of stimulating materials, which leads to boredom.
Makes sense. If the stuff isn't interesting, kids aren't going to be motivated to learn.
Exactly. So that brings us to the second key aspect, the importance of having really interesting curricular materials and activities.
Because if kids have free choice, those choices have to be genuinely appealing.
Right. And there's a ton of research in educational psychology showing that learning is way more effective when kids are interested.
So tapping into their curiosity is key.
Absolutely. And Montessori materials and lessons, they were designed like meticulously through years of observation and experimentation to capture kids' attention.
So they're not just random toys and activities.
No, they're very intentional. And Montessori teachers are trained to present these materials in a way that sparks that initial interest.
Like how?
Well, making them visually appealing, making their purpose clear, and connecting them to the child's imagination.
So it's about creating this sense of wonder and intrigue.
Exactly. And the paper highlights two really important characteristics of Montessori work that make it so engaging. It's embodied and interconnected.
Okay, let's break those down, starting with embodied cognition. What does that even mean?
So embodied cognition, it's basically the idea that our thinking isn't just this abstract thing happening in our heads. It's deeply tied to our physical experiences, our senses, our movements.
So it's about learning by doing, not just by thinking.
Exactly. Often actively doing something is way more effective for learning and remembering than passively listening or watching. And Montessori, she totally got this. Like Jean Piaget, the famous developmental psychologist, he actually took a Montessori training course. And he said that Montessori understood that kids learn best through active engagement with their environment, not just through abstract thinking.
So it's about getting your hands dirty, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And Montessori classrooms are full of hands-on materials that let kids physically manipulate objects and learn through their senses.
Like what kind of materials?
Well, think about learning geometry, for example. In a Montessori classroom, kids might start by folding cloth napkins into different shapes, like squares, rectangles, triangles.
Oh, I see.
And then later, they might use these metal insets, which are basically metal frames with shapes cut out, and they trace the outlines of the shapes with their fingers.
Oh, that's cool.
And that also indirectly prepares their hands for writing.
Interesting.
And then they might explore those same shapes using a geometry cabinet, so they're engaging their sense of touch and movement while learning the names of the shapes.
Like they're building up this multi-sensory understanding of geometry.
Exactly. And those same shapes, they even popped up later when they start learning about grammar with different shapes representing different parts of speech.
So it all ties together.
It does. And Montessori was also really big on developing fine motor skills through activities like pouring, buttoning, sewing, all that stuff.
Right, those little things that require dexterity.
Yeah, and research has shown that those skills are linked to intelligence and doing well in school later on.
So it's not just about keeping kids busy, it's about building those foundational skills.
Exactly.
That's a great example of how the physical and the intellectual were intertwined in Montessori. Now, what about the interconnectedness piece?
So that's about how well new information connects to what you already know. And research shows that people are more interested in learning and they learn better when they can see those connections.
Right, it's about making learning meaningful.
Exactly. And the Montessori curriculum is intentionally designed to build those connections in this spiral way.
So you revisit concepts multiple times, but at increasingly complex levels.
Mm-hmm. And they constantly link back to those core foundational ideas. Like the paper mentions how something as simple as folding a napkin can later connect to the abstract concept of grammar.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
And that's just one example. At the elementary level, ages 6 to 12, this interconnectedness is even more explicit through something called cosmic education.
Cosmic education.
Yeah, it's this broad, integrated curriculum that presents the universe and everything in it as interconnected.
So it's like a holistic view of the world.
Exactly. And it emphasizes that every living thing has a unique and important role to play.
I like that.
So this approach of intentionally connecting new knowledge to what kids already know, it makes learning more relevant and engaging.
Makes sense. So work that's interesting, embodied, and interconnected, that naturally leads to the next point,
Yeah.
right? Developing concentrated attention.
Exactly. When kids are really engaged in something they've chosen, something that speaks to their interests and their developmental needs, they become absorbed in it.
I think in the zone.
Totally. And they develop these amazing levels of concentration. And that ability to focus, that's a crucial part of executive function, those cognitive skills we talked about earlier.
Like those skills that are linked to success in school and in life.
hmm And Montessori, she observed this firsthand. She said that when kids start to really concentrate on their work, their whole personality changes. They become more self-disciplined, happier, even more empathetic.
Wow, so concentration is like this gateway to all these positive qualities.
It seems so. And research has shown that Montessori education, with all that self-directed work and those uninterrupted work periods, it really supports the development of those executive function skills.
So it's not just about learning specific content, it's about developing those core mental abilities.
Exactly.
And that deep focus, it connects to the idea that in Montessori, all the rewards are intrinsic.
Right. They don't use things like grades or praise given too freely or sticker charts.
Interesting. Those are pretty common in traditional schools.
They are. But the idea is that those external rewards can actually undermine a child's self-determination.
How so?
Well, it shifts their focus from the joy of learning itself to getting that external reward.
Oh, I see. So they're not doing it for the love of learning. They're doing it for the sticker or the good grade.
Exactly. And Montessori classrooms are designed to avoid that. There are usually no letter grades in the early years, and teachers are trained to give specific feedback only when a child asks for it.
So it's about letting kids discover the inherent satisfaction of learning for themselves.
hmm And the materials themselves are often self-correcting, so kids can figure out their own mistakes without needing someone to tell them they're wrong.
That's a really different approach.
It is, and it aligns with a ton of research showing that external rewards can actually backfire and make kids less motivated in the long run.
So it's about fostering that intrinsic drive, that love of learning for its own sake.
Exactly.
Now, one thing people might assume about Montessori is that it's very individualistic. Like each kid is just off doing their own thing.
Yeah, that's a common misconception. And it's true that younger kids in Montessori classrooms, they often work independently, but they're still in this very social environment, and they interact with their peers a lot.
Like how?
Well, older kids often help younger kids, kind of like natural peer tutoring. And as they move into elementary school, collaborative work becomes more central.
So they start working together on projects and stuff.
Yeah, they do research together, give presentations, all that.
So it's not just about individual learning. It's about learning how to work together effectively.
Exactly. And that progression from more independent work to more collaborative work, it makes sense developmentally. Like younger kids need that time to explore and figure things out on their own. And then as they get older, they're more ready for that social learning.
Makes sense.
And there's a ton of research showing that peer tutoring and collaborative learning are really effective.
So it's not just a Montessori thing. It's a good educational practice in general.
Totally.
Now, for this kind of self-directed learning to work, the relationship between the teacher and the child must be really important.
Right. Absolutely. It's essential. Because in a Montessori classroom, the teacher isn't the one standing at the front lecturing. They're more like a guide, a facilitator.
Right, so they're creating the environment and then stepping back to let the learning happen.
Exactly. And for that to work, the teacher-child relationships have to be really strong, like warm, supportive, respectful.
It's about building trust.
Totally. And Montessori knew this. She was very big on the quality of those interactions. And her guidance to teachers, it actually lines up a lot with what we know about secure attachment and authoritative parenting.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's about providing clear boundaries and guidance while also supporting.